We fear death as a void, as an ending. But what if that fear was planted because buried beneath sand and silence is a sacred text, not meant to terrify us, but to awaken us? It begins not with a scream, but with a whisper beneath a sarcophagus. The ancients didn't fear death. They studied it, prepared for it, crafted entire cosmologies around it not to escape the end, but to navigate the beginning. And among the most profound of these sacred blueprints was what we now call the Egyptian Book of the Dead, though to them, it was the book of coming forth by day. Not a book of finality, but of emergence, of becoming, of remembrance. Yet what survives in museums and modern translations is only the outer shell, a language gutted of its mystical organs. We read spells but do not understand their architecture. We observe funerary rites without realizing their maps of consciousness. We see death but miss the symphony of rebirth. What no one tells you is that this book is not just for the dead. It is a manual for the living, a guide through the illusions of this world and the next. So let us descend. Let us unroll the scroll, inked in sacred red and black, and step into the mythic underworld not as victims, but as voyagers. For when we truly read this book, we do not escape death. We remember that we were never meant to die. Before pyramids pierced the heavens, before hieroglyphs carved prayers into stone, there was the murmur of memory, an ancestral knowing, a sacred conversation between soul and cosmos. And it did not begin with fear. It began with preparation. In the Egypt of antiquity, death was not a rupture. It was an anticipated transition, a long-planned journey into the unseen. Not a tragedy, but a return. Every sarcophagus, every tomb wall, every funerary papyrus was inked with more than symbols. They were spells, yes, but not in the Hollywood sense. Not sorcery, but sound codes. Words encoded with vibration. Phrases woven with intention. Mantras that operated like keys, unlocking gates between dimensions. Each utterance was called a heka, a word of power. Not to command the gods, but to attune oneself to the divine current. A spiritual harmonization, a resonance with the architecture of eternity. The dead were not silent. They were guided, whispered to, protected through the journey by text as technology's sacred scripts, as navigational tools for the soul's unfolding. But here's the deeper truth. These spells were never meant solely for the dead. The book's original title, Haretunabadu Dutabu Purdi, Aintuam Forgiabu, means the spells of coming forth by day. To come forth, to emerge from darkness into light. In this context, day means consciousness, awakening, awareness beyond illusion. The scroll wasn't just a post-mortem guide. It was a metaphysical mirror, teaching the living how to die before they die, to pierce through ego, identity, and attachment until only the eternal self remains. Every passage, every glyph, was a conversation between the initiate and the infinite. Take spell 125, the famed weighing of the heart ritual. To the untrained eye, it reads like mythology. A soul faces judgment before gods, declaring innocence before the feather of Ma'at. But hidden within the litany of I have not is a spiritual audit, a purification of the psyche. Each denial is not a lie, but an aspiration, a ritual of becoming light. To speak these words was not to assert one's virtue, it was to align with it. To become light enough to pass through the vibrational gate. And so, the sarcophagus was not a coffin, it was a chrysalis. The body, wrapped in linen and language, was suspended not in death, but in transformation. To the Egyptians, the true danger was not dying, it was forgetting, becoming lost in the chaotic waters of the Duat, the liminal space between worlds. Which is why the book was placed beside the deceased to remind, to call them back to themselves, to guide them through realms that mirrored the subconscious. But here's the paradox. The Duat was not only an afterlife realm, it was also this world, the world we walk every day, unaware. This reality, too, is filled with illusions, trials, guardians, temptations, and false light. So, the book does not begin with death. It begins with the soul waking up inside the dream. And the whisper beneath the sarcophagus is not mourning. It is a memory of who you were before the world taught you to forget. Imagine this. You awaken not in a room, but in a realm without edges. No time, No ground, only the echo of your own essence rippling across an ocean of stars. This is the Duat. To most, it appears as the Egyptian underworld, a mythic landscape filled with serpents, gates, gods, and trials. But to the initiated, it is something far more precise. A psycho-spiritual map, a blueprint of the soul's architecture, an atlas of invisible realms, each region not a place, but a state of being. The Book of the Dead, then, was not a storybook. It was a cartographic device. A soul GPS? Not in the linear sense from point A to point B, but in the spiraling pattern of inner initiation. Each spell, each hymn, each vignette unfolds like coordinates. Together, they form a cosmological geometry that encodes the full cycle of soul-death dismemberment, judgment, recognition, transfiguration. The 12 gates of the night, the lake of fire, the field of rushes, the house of hearts. These are not merely esoteric curiosities. They are mirrors of what the soul must face within. In the third hour of the Duat, the soul journeys through a region where time itself disintegrates. The sun, now a hidden orb, is ferried on a serpent bark through utter darkness. Here, there are no landmarks. Only internal light can guide the way. This is a test of trust, a chamber of initiation where ego cannot follow, where identity dissolves. In modern terms, we might call this the dark night of the soul, the void, the moment in spiritual death when all beliefs crumble and silence becomes the only teacher. Then in the fifth hour, we find a confrontation with Apophis, the great serpent of chaos. He does not represent evil. He represents the unintegrated shadow, fear, guilt, despair, the aspects of self we buried. To slay Apophis is not to destroy that part of you. It is to recognize it, to wield the eye of awareness, the same eye that Horus lost and Thoth restored. This is what the ancients meant by Heka. Not just chanting spells, but reclaiming symbolic power. Every gate, every beast, every trial in the Duat corresponds to an archetype in the psyche, a forgotten wound, a hidden truth, a soul lesson written in mythic language. And if the soul passed through these trials, it emerged not in some heavenly paradise, but in alignment. In resonance with Ma'at, the principle of sacred order, of balance, truth, and universal harmony. In that resonance, the soul would come forth by day, which meant it would awaken, not merely in some distant afterlife, but now, here, in this incarnation, in this dream. You see, the map wasn't just to navigate death, it was to navigate life as a field of initiation. Because the real Duat was always within, and every hardship, every grief, every spiritual crisis was one more glyph in the soul's cartography, one more gate on the way home. In the half-light of eternity, there's a chamber that waits for every soul. Silent, vast, etched in gold and shadow. At its center, a balance. On one side, a heart. On the other, a feather. Not just any feather, but the sacred plume of Ma'at, the cosmic principle of harmony, justice, and truth. Here, the soul does not face punishment. It faces itself. In the most iconic scene of the Book of the Dead spell 125, the soul stands before 42 judges and speaks a list of negative confessions. I have not stolen, I have not killed, I have not lied, I have not caused suffering. To the modern eye, it looks like a moral checklist. But this is no court of guilt or innocence. It is an alchemical rite. Each I have not is a tuning fork, a vibration that aligns the heart with cosmic order. Not a denial, but a declaration of aspiration, a vow to the self. To pass through this chamber is not to be perfect, but to be light. Because in Egyptian metaphysics, the heart was more than a physical organ. It was the seat of the soul, the memory of one's life. Unlike the brain, which was removed and discarded during mummification, the heart was preserved. It was the recorder, the ledger of the inner world. And it is weighed not against law, but against truth. If the heart is heavy with regret, deceit, violence, or delusion, it tips the scales. And then comes Amit the Devourer, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. She does not punish, she recycles! A heart not in balance with Ma'at is not condemned. It is returned to the cycle, to try again, to live another life, and learn what was missed. But if the scales balance, if the heart is light enough to match the feather, Then the soul passes through the veil and becomes an Ak, a radiant being. Not just alive, but illuminated. This weighing of the heart is more than myth. It is a ritual still unfolding within us. Every choice, every moment of truth or betrayal tips the scale. And Ma'at is not just a goddess. She is a presence, a universal law, a frequency. To live in Ma'at is to live in alignment, to act from soul, not ego. To speak words that ring with integrity, to honor the unseen threads of consequence. This is why the Book of the Dead emphasizes speech. Spells are not cast, they are spoken. The heart is not measured by deeds alone, but by word and vibration. Because to the ancients, words were not mere sounds. They were beings, entities that shaped reality. To speak falsely was not just immoral, it was a fracture in the fabric of the cosmos. And so the judgment scene is not about reward or punishment. It is about coherence. The soul that is true in word, in thought, in being becomes light. Not metaphorically. Literally. It rejoins the solar bark. It travels with Ra across the heavens. It becomes one with the stars. And here's the hidden thread. Every culture has its echo of this moment. The Tibetan Bardo's mirror, the Christian reckoning, the Sumerian descent. Each one a symbolic rendering of the same inner truth. The soul weighs itself, not through shame, but through remembrance. And the heart, when unburdened by illusion, is already lighter than a feather. Papyrus rustles like breath. Not the breath of lungs, but of galaxies. The Book of the Dead was not written in prose. It was not read. It was activated. Every glyph, every symbol, every painted god was not just a message. It was a portal. You see, the ancients didn't draw, but they encoded. Hieroglyphs were not illustrations. They were multi-dimensional language systems, each image carrying sound, idea, spirit, and frequency. In modern terms, we might call this interdimensional semiotics, symbols that don't just convey meaning, but transmit states of being. Take, for instance, the Eye of Horus. To Westerners, it's often seen as decoration, mystical flair, but the eye, in truth, was a cosmic equation. Its 6 parts, mathematically precise, each represent a fraction, 1, 2, 1, 4, 1, 8, 1, 16, 1, 32, 1, 64. Together they form 6364, never quite whole. Why? Because the final piece, the missing fraction, is transcendent, beyond number, beyond perception. It is a reminder that wholeness is never achieved through material means alone. It is completed only through the spiritual. This same principle is echoed across the scroll gods with animal heads, ankhs that resemble tuning forks, pyramids aligned with stars. Each image a gateway, each spell a coordinate. Because the Egyptians weren't just concerned with death, they were mapping the soul's return to the stars. The Duat was often drawn as a series of hours, 12 nocturnal gates, mirroring the sun's passage through the underworld. But look closer and you'll see astronomical precision. These weren't just symbolic hours. They aligned with constellations, celestial cycles, the precession of equinoxes. And Ra's journey through the Duat wasn't just the sun setting. It was the soul moving through dimensions, each hour a vibrational octave, each gate a shift in consciousness. This is why the Book of Coming Forth by Day was often buried with the deceased not just beside the body, but oriented to celestial north. To guide the Ka, the soul essence, not down, but up, to the imperishable stars, to the circumpolar constellations that never dipped below the horizon, to become one with the undying sky. And here's where modern science stumbles into mysticism. Quantum physicists now speak of non-local consciousness, vibrational states, entangled realities. The Egyptians already knew. Their temples were not places of worship. They were frequency chambers, initiation sites where sound, light, and sacred geometry aligned the initiate with cosmic rhythm. And their texts not manuals for the dead, but star maps for the soul. Which is why the spells often begin with, "I know the secret names. I know the paths of the stars. I am he who rises in the bark of millions of years." These are not metaphors. They are codes of identity. Declarations that the initiate, having passed through ego, illusion, and fear, has reclaimed their stellar origin. That they are not flesh seeking heaven, but light remembering its trajectory. And so the scroll becomes a stargate, not a wormhole through space, but a corridor through vibration, a return through symbol, sound, and soul. The book, then, is not a relic. It is a reminder that you, too, are a traveler, not bound to body, not defined by death, but scripted in starlight. And when you remember how to read the symbols not with the eyes, but with the spirit, the path reveals itself. It always has. There comes a moment on the soul's journey when light flickers, when all maps collapse, when even memory feels like a lie. This is the threshold. The abyss is not a pit. It is a silence so deep it mirrors your unspoken self. And in that silence, something watches. Not a monster, but a mirror that shows you everything you were too afraid to see. This is where most souls falter, not from judgment, but from forgetting. Forgetting they were never the name they wore, never the pain they carried, never the roles, the regrets, the illusions. And this is where the Book of the Dead offers its most mysterious tool, the spell of self-remembrance. Spell 30B is among the most potent. It begins, "O my heart, which I had from my mother, O my heart of my different ages, do not stand against me as a witness." This is not a plea. It is a negotiation with the soul's shadow, a reminder that your heart, your record, your truth need not betray you if you know its name. In Egyptian cosmology, to name something is to know its essence. To speak the true name of a god is to invoke its power. To speak the true name of yourself is to remember your immortality, which is why so many of the book's spells are filled with strange phrases. I am the flame that shineth in the eye of Ra. I am yesterday. I know tomorrow. I am the soul of the god. I am eternal. These are not boasts. They are activations. Affirmations that pierce illusion. Incantations that remind the soul of its cosmic identity when the abyss tries to seduce it back into sleep. The spells do not defeat death. They reveal it. As a veil, as a rite, as a test of frequency. And fear is the gatekeeper. But what fools fear, what disarms the devourer, is truth spoken without hesitation. That is why the book is so meticulous. Each spell precisely crafted, each phrase rhythmically tuned. Not because the gods are bureaucrats, but because the universe is vibrational. You do not enter the next realm with a passport. You enter with resonance. And fear, the great dimmer of the soul, lowers your tone, binds your wings. But sacred language, when spoken from memory, from knowing, from embodied divinity, cuts through. It is the flashlight in the cave, the frequency that shifts the room, the spell that makes the abyss blink first. There are moments, even in waking life, when this happens. When you speak a truth you thought would break you and feel power surge instead. That is the spell. That is the moment the dead were trained for. Because death, in this framework, is not a thief. It is a ritual theater, a final act of the soul's initiation. And if you know the lines, if you remember your role, not as victim, but voyager, then the darkness opens like a lotus. You pass through untouched, not because you fought, but because you remembered. And that fools the abyss, because the abyss has no power over the one who has already died before dying. We are taught that the body is a cage, that spirit is light and flesh is weight, that to ascend, we must escape this vessel. But the ancient Egyptians saw it differently. To them, the body was not a prison. It was a temple, not to be denied, but to be decoded. Every limb, every organ, every bone was a living glyph, a channel for cosmic energy, a microcosm of divine architecture. They mapped the self not as a singular unit, but as a constellation of souls. Yes, not one soul, but many. The Ka, the vital essence, the Ba, the mobile personality, often depicted as a bird, the Ak, the radiant spirit, transfigured and immortal, the Ren, the true name, your spiritual signature, the Shut, your shadow, the echo of form, and more still intertwined aspects of being, each with its own frequency, its own purpose in the grand unfolding. This was esoteric anatomy. A model of consciousness that understood to be human is not to be singular, but orchestrated. Like a symphony, and the body, the sacred instrument. Rituals of mummification were not macabre. They were precision rites to preserve the resonance of form. The brain seat of illusion was discarded, but the heart seat of soul memory was wrapped in amulets, protected, prepared to speak in the next world. The spine was aligned, the organs were sanctified, and spells were whispered into linen wrappings, so that every layer of the body would remember its divine encoding. Because in death, you did not shed the body. You transcended its density. You awakened to the subtle body. The Egyptians called these forms the Sahu, and the Khat bodies of light and vibration that existed in tandem with the flesh. Modern mystics might refer to these as the etheric, the astral, the causal. Science calls them theoretical. But to the ancients, they were essential. They knew that you couldn't pass through the trials of the Duat with sinew and bone, but neither could you survive without knowing how your flesh was coded. To speak the spells, to align with Ma'at, to sail with Ra, you had to carry your entire being across dimensions. That included your form, which is why, in spell after spell, the deceased proclaims, "I have not forgotten my limbs. My legs are beneath me. My arms are beside me. My heart is strong. My mouth is pure." These are not just affirmations. They are spiritual checkpoints, confirmations that the soul is still intact, still harmonized. And here lies the great reversal. The body was never the obstacle. It was the initiation chamber. Each pain, each pleasure, each wound, each ecstasy a lesson etched in living stone. And when the soul finally emerges from the chrysalis of flesh, it does not discard it in disdain. It honors it. Because the temple may dissolve, but its architecture remains encoded in the soul's light body, carried through dimensions like a sacred memory of incarnation. And so, perhaps the body was never meant to be escaped. Perhaps it was meant to be sacralized, to be lived in as a sacred act, to be remembered not as a mistake, but as a key. Because in the end, it was never about leaving the body behind. It was about bringing the light in. Beyond the final gate, beyond the weighing of the heart, beyond the bark that sails through starlit waters, lies a realm few remember. It is not a heaven of clouds, no harps, no halos. It is a field, vast, lush, whispering. The field of reeds, known as Aru in the ancient tongue. This was not a reward, but a resonance, a frequency attained by those who had become whole. Aru was not granted. It was earned not through deeds, but through remembrance. It mirrored the Nile's lush banks, but more perfect. An echo of the world cleansed of distortion. There, the soul farms. Yes, farms. Not in toil, but in sacred co-creation with the land. The crops grow tall, the waters run pure, and the sky glows with a golden hush. Why farming? Because Aru is a return to rhythm, to the natural harmony between self and cosmos. It is the spiritual archetype of Eden, of Shambhala, of the Pure Lands. Not a place to rest, a place to create in perfect balance. The soul is not idle here. It continues to refine, to evolve. But now in joy no longer bound by karma, distortion, or density. And just as the Duat reflects the unconscious mind, Aru reflects the resonant self, the self stripped of masks, the soul as song. This realm is not above us. It is not below. It is within. That is the forgotten truth. The field of reeds is not a distant reward, but a state of being you can begin to touch even now. Every time you speak from love, rather than fear, every time you align thought with truth, every time you walk in rhythm with your own breath, you plant a seed in Aru. Because Aru is not an escape from Earth, it is Earth remembered. The way it was before distortion, before disconnection. It is the vibrational echo of what was lost and what can be returned to. This is why the spells in the book speak not just of reaching Aru, but of becoming worthy of it. Not through judgment, but through resonance. To enter Aru, the soul must become like Ma'at balanced, true, light, radiant. This is why spell 110 proclaims, "I know the names of the gods who dwell in the field of reeds. I eat of their bread. I live in their time." To know the names is to match the frequency. To live in their time is to transcend linear time and step into sacred rhythm. The field is not a finish line. It is a return. To the origin before forgetting, to the garden before exile, to the tone before distortion. It is not distant. It is the soft hum that calls to you in dreams. The golden edge of silence you sometimes feel just before waking. And in moments of deep peace, when your breath slows and your heart remembers, you touch it, if only for a second. Because Aru is not a myth. It is the soul's own echo, calling itself home. It was not just time that buried the Book of the Dead. It was conquest. It was arrogance. It was the slow silencing of spirit beneath the weight of empire. When the Western world discovered ancient Egypt, it did not listen. It interpreted, through its own lens, its own fears, its own broken cosmology. And in that interpretation, something holy was lost. The RWNW Purte, the Book of Coming Forth by day, was renamed the Book of the Dead by 19th century scholars who saw only funerary rituals, not star maps. They saw death, but not transfiguration, judgment, but not initiation, myth, but not metaphysical memory. They cataloged gods as deities, but failed to see them as archetypal forces within the psyche. They translated spells into flat instruction, but ignored the vibrational geometry of the original tongue. What they called magic, the ancients called science of the unseen. And what they dismissed as superstition was a system of spiritual physics far older, and in many ways far more refined than their own theological institutions. Even the art was misunderstood. Paintings of souls speaking to ibis-headed gods were labeled primitive religious expressions, not recognized as symbolic neurocartographies, mapping dream states, energetic anatomy, and the multi-layered structure of human consciousness. Why? Because to acknowledge the depth of Egyptian metaphysics would require unlearning. It would require admitting that colonized civilizations held truths that modernity had forgotten. That spiritual sovereignty once thrived without dogma. That consciousness was studied not with microscopes, but with memory. So instead, Western scholars dissected mummies, but never studied the soul. They hoarded papyri, but never understood their frequencies. They displayed tomb artifacts in glass cases, but left their deeper meanings entombed beneath mistranslation. Even today, most modern readings of the book lack the initiatory framework. They focus on ritual and rite without perceiving the path of awakening beneath the glyphs. Because this book is not linear, it cannot be read like a novel. It must be unfolded like a spiral, lived, felt, spoken. This is why ancient Egyptian priests were not just religious figures. They were scientists of the soul, keepers of frequency, guardians of Heka sacred speech. Their temples were not houses of worship, they were laboratories of light. And the book, it was the final curriculum, the last syllabus the soul would study before returning to the stars. Yet the Western world, in its obsession with ownership, lost what could never be possessed vibration. And so it was left blind, not because the truth was hidden, but because the eyes were trained only to see the material. But now, in this age of remembering, a new question arises. What happens when we read the book again, not with the scholar's pen, but with the initiate's heart? What happens when we stop translating and start listening? What happens when we no longer seek to understand death as an ending, but as an invitation to become what we truly are? We began with a question. Not what is death, but what was lost when we forgot how to die well. What no one told you about the Book of the Dead is that it was never a book about endings. It was a map of becoming. A living manuscript, coded not with dogma, but with frequencies of awakening. It taught that death is not the opposite of life, but its mirror. A sacred rite of release through which we remember who we were before the names, before the fears, before the world told us we were small. The Book of Coming Forth by Day whispers to something ancient inside you. Not to escape death, but to become fluent in it. To rehearse the letting go of identities, attachments, illusions so completely that when the final veil parts, you do not tremble. You rise, as one who has walked these paths before, as one who carries the map within. And this is the forgotten truth. You don't have to wait for death to remember. You can begin now in stillness, in silence, in sacred speech. You can weigh your heart before the scales find you. You can learn to speak your true name again. You can walk through the Duat in dreams, in meditation, in the moments when grief breaks you open enough to hear the whisper beneath the sarcophagus. And if you do, if you walk the spiral, if you speak the spells not from fear but from knowing, you'll find that the gates open, not because you forced them, but because they always recognized you. And when your heart, light as Mot's feather, passes through the final door, you will not vanish. You will come forth by day, because perhaps the veil was never closed. We simply forgot we were light.